Final lecture in Liberation Spirituality. Peace, Prayer, and Protest. Henri Nouwen and Gustavo Guitierrez as brothers in dialogue. In his journal, Henri writes, "There is a little man in Peru, a man without any power, who lives in a barrio with poor people, and who wrote a book. In this book, he simply reclaimed the basic Christian truth that God became human to bring good news to the poor, new light to the blind, liberty to the captive. Then, years later, this book and movement it started is considered a danger by the United States, the greatest power on earth. When I look at this little man, Gustavo, and think about the President of the United States, I see David standing before Goliath again with no more weapon than a little stone, a stone called a Theology of Liberation." In this lecture, I want to share with you the wisdom of Gustavo Guitierrez, regarded as the father of liberation theology in Latin America, and one of his most famous students, Henri Nouwen, noted professor at Yale and Harvard in North America. Henri, an active contemplative priest from Holland, Gustavo, a contemplative active priest in Peru. And their dialogue about prayerful resistance and peaceful protest in a world of fear and domination. A theology of liberation, first as a prophetic movement and then as a most influential book, emerged during apocalyptic year 1968 in Lima, Peru. There, Latin American bishops in the Roman Catholic Church gathered to reflect on their shared experience of ministry with economically disenfranchised communities in Central and South America, and the unjust systems of oppression that supported the rich and squashed the poor. Perhaps Archbishop Dom Helder Câmara of Brazil summed up the problem best when he said, "When I fed the poor, they called me a saint. When I asked, why are these people poor, they called me a communist." He was speaking about both politicians and the church hierarchy who were threatened by liberation theology and considered it subversive. Much attention was paid to these bishops and the Christian communities behind them when they issued a statement calling for the liberation of God's people. Quote, "We are on the threshold of a new epoch in the history of Latin America," they wrote. "A crucial moment in our history and struggle, a turning point whose time has come." The movement drew biblical inspiration from the story of the Exodus from Egypt and hope for a promised land. It's worth looking at that again and preaching from it if you're pastors. Exodus 3, verse 7, "Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me, and I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. I will send you to Pharaoh to say, let my people go." You see, in certain moments, crucial moments in time, God is revealed as a deliverer, as a liberator. When the cries of the people become desperate enough, crucial enough, finally, someone among God's people hears the cries, like Moses. And when God hears the cries and calls people to respond, the response is a deliverance, a liberation for the people of God. How long, O Lord, how long? I have heard the cries. Let my people go. You see, it doesn't take Marxist analysis to observe that world history is one long struggle of human existence, a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, the great, the least, those with the means and resources and those without the means and resources, the rich, the poor. However you want to break it up, there's a struggle of existence. And God looks down in anger on the arena of human struggle and is not impartial. God takes sides. God has a preference. And the side God takes consistently in the scriptures is the side of the underdog, the poor, the oppressed, the outcast, the left out. And it's not like God favors the poor over the rich in any ultimate way, because ultimately, as we know, God is no respecter of persons. But when it comes to inflicting pain and suffering by one group on another group, God has to take sides. And the side God takes is the side of the oppressed, and it feels to the oppressor that God has favorites, and indeed God does. You know, it's like the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not that all lives don't matter, for to God all lives matter. But when black lives haven't mattered for centuries, then God takes that particular interest and lifts up a particular group of people in need of justice and deliverance, hope. Well, and so knowing the Exodus story, knowing the incarnational story, these church leaders pledged themselves in Lima, Peru, with zeal for full emancipation, of liberation from every form of servitude, oppression, and injustice affecting their people. And they called for a kingdom of life on earth, not just in heaven by and by. They called for life more abundantly on earth as it is in heaven. One of the church leaders, Father Gustavo Guitierrez, believed that they were witnessing, quote, an obvious sign of the Spirit, a new historical stage in the struggle of existence, a prophetic time to proclaim a liberating gospel in Latin America. So in the language of the Bible, he said, quote, we are in a kairos, a propitious and demanding time in which the Lord challenges us to bear a very specific witness. I'm quoting from his introduction to A Theology of Liberation. Gustavo then emerges as a popular theologian in Latin America in the late 1960s. His sermons and courses were prophetic for liberation movements in Latin America and around the world. Gustavo offered 3 simple principles for how to interpret the Bible in one's particular context and social location. 1, reflect on human experience of God's action in the world. 2, read the Bible through the eyes of the poor. 3, proclaim God's kingdom of life more abundant, Zoe in Greek, spiritual life here and now, human flourishing, shalom for all. Those 3 principles can be expanded upon, perhaps I will later, and I do have a PowerPoint for it as well. But liberation theology in Latin America is focused on the socioeconomic injustice and priority of ministry with the poor. Now, this is an economic focus in its origins. Not that the rich were excluded from God's love and salvation, but that the economically disadvantaged were being exploited by the rich and needed more attention, more advocacy, more solidarity. Rich Christians may need pastoral care and discipleship so that their consciousness can be raised, so that they can learn how to seek justice. But God's people who are poor and in need of social and spiritual liberation, that's the focus of liberation. Now, liberation theologies in the United States focus less on the socioeconomic injustice, or less on poverty, let's say, and more on racial and cultural injustices. This widening focus has given rise to new theologies of liberation, including Black liberation theology, feminist theology, womanist theology, gay, lesbian, and queer theologies. As someone in our class said last week, there are now about 45 liberation theologies in the world, which is probably true. What is spirituality? It's different than theology. It's different than psychology. According to Henri Nouwen, spirituality is found at the intersection, and it's the subject matter of our personal connection, our relationship to God, lived out in communities of faith and practice. Now, according to Gustavo, spirituality emerges from the struggle of the people. In his book, We Drink from Our Own Wells, Gustavo makes 3 simple points. 1, everyone has to drink from his or her own well. Simply stated, each one of us must find our own deep well and drink the water of life that is right for us. It's like God is this great underground river whose beginning is nowhere, whose end is everywhere, this great underground stream. And you got to tap into the water of life. And there's many, many wells. Some wells are deeper than others. Some wells are shallow wells. But you find your own deep well. You tap in through particularity into the one, the unified stream of God. We each must find that for ourselves. But not just by ourselves. For number 2, but no one drinks alone. See, we all have drunk from wells we did not dig. We all have enjoyed fresh water that is not entirely our own. Hence, the essential need for community. Simply stated, spirituality is not a merely personal event or a private practice or the product of individual pursuit. Rather, authentic spirituality is corporate and connected to all the people of God. And 3, spirituality is like living water that springs up in the very depths of the experience of faith. So writes Gustavo. Quote, to drink from your own well is to live your own life in the Spirit of Jesus as you have encountered him in your concrete historical reality. Simply stated, I think, authentic spirituality bubbles up from the struggle, not just your own struggle, but the struggle of the people of God, from a particular social context of that struggle for liberation. So how do we draw water and wisdom from our own personal experience of God and from our community of faith and from the larger struggle of the people of God in the world as we seek justice and liberation for all? Let's take a break and I'll come back with part 2.